All of you had a blessed Thanksgiving. We got to spend it with my side of the family. My mother was down from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, so I would love to get a chance to spend time with my mother. Although my sister was quite loquacious and I didn't get many chances to speak. I am the family genealogist. I suppose there's, someone keeps the family tree, statistics. In many families, I happen to be that person. And I've done it for many years, mainly by collecting family documents. And I was really blessed in that one of my grandmothers left me a postcard from a friend in 1916 that traced our family tree back to the Revolutionary War. And with, of course, the advent of the internet and the explosion of information available, I've really been able to fill out the family tree nicely and, in fact, correct just a couple of inaccuracies. But I've traced my father's family back to George Phelps, born in England in 1606, and my mother's family back to 1760 in Pennsylvania. And I have birth dates, dates of death, marriage information about hundreds of my ancestors. But, for my purposes, I've narrowed the family tree right down to me and then my children. A number of years ago, I received a call from a gentleman named David Phelps, not the David Phelps you're probably thinking of, but from a fellow named David Phelps up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that said, I think we share the same great-great-grandfather. And so sure enough, I checked back in the family tree, and although I didn't have David, I was able to verify that grandfather and then help him trace the line all the way back. So we were able to work together, but the point is, with all those lines and all those branches and even twigs in the family tree, generally, when you're looking, you focus in on one family, and that's yours, because there's just almost too much information if you try to maintain everyone's. In the past few weeks, we've been studying about the origins and history of mankind. But today, we're going to narrow the family tree down to one line. As I prepared the lessons a few weeks ago, I'm so sorry that I neglected to tell you that we've been galloping along at 2 chapters per week. Not going to do that anymore. We're going to just take 1 chapter a week because these are pretty meaty chapters now. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 12 today. So if you'll turn there. When we closed chapter 11, we had started to narrow down the family tree because we had talked about Terah, who was the father of Abram. And there's one little interesting factoid that I want to kind of bring out to you, is that one of the things that we noted about Terah is that he, for some reason, had believed that his homeland should be in Canaan, and he set out for Canaan. From Ur of the Chaldees, but he didn't make it. He just made it to Haran. Now that's kind of an interesting voyage because Ur of the Chaldees is well east of the Holy Land. What you know of the Holy Land, it's in Mesopotamia. But Haran is on the northeast corner of Canaan, the northeast of the Holy Land. So he kind of went a circuitous route, but he didn't make it into Canaan. And so when we pick up the story of Abram, that's where he was. Now, the name Abram, you need to remember, is the name that he was given. It's not the name that you know him by. And it's quite possible that during the lesson today or next week or even the following week, before his name is changed, I'll refer to him as Abraham. Please forgive that slip, if you will. He is Abram, and the Lord calls him. Now, here's what's interesting about that too, because he was a pagan worshiper, likely, at the time. We know that his father, Terah, was a pagan worshiper, so it's quite likely that Abram was raised in that family environment. But we know that somewhere along the line, he became a follower and called on the name of the one true God. And the Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to a land I will show you. I don't know about you, but when God makes a call on your life, you like it to be pretty specific. You know? What did he tell Abram? Go. Okay, Lord, where? When? How? Which bus do I catch? Go. He said, I'll show you the land. You just set out, and I'll show you the land. Now, he made promises to him, and I want you to look as we go along, because he's going to make 7 promises to him. 7 promises. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Wow. You stop and think about, another person says that to you, that's nice. But when God says that to you, He can deliver. And so what he's saying is that to a person whose whole purpose for life is to procreate, to raise descendants. Remember, that's what God asked them to do. Big families were considered to be a blessing. And he says, you know what? I'm going to make of your household a great nation. And I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you prosperous. And then he says, I'm going to make your name great. People today would love that. We've got this famous mania. But he said, I'm going to make your name great. You'll be known throughout the world. It even goes so far as to say, not only am I going to bless you, when Nancy blesses you, I'm going to bless her for blessing you. And if someone has the temerity, if someone just has the gall to curse you, I'm going to curse them. And then he closes it with one of the most incredible blessings one could receive. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. You got to know that came true. We have the advantage of hindsight, and we look back and say, did you notice that nobody ever says, Father Terah had many sons? No. Father Abraham had many sons. He told him, I want you to go. And then he gives him a blessing, and what's the very next thing that we see in terms of action in verse 4? He said, you go. Abram left. It didn't say Abram argued. It didn't say Abram questioned. It didn't say Abram, said, I'm going to sit this one out and just make sure. Abram left. Now, I want to tell you that we think of Abram and the early Hebrews as living a nomadic existence. And while that is true, it wasn't true at this time. They were city boys. They were urban dwellers. They lived in what passed for they were large-sized cities, even in those days. And so the Lord said, I want you to hit the road, and I want you to get in your RV and stay there for a while. I want you to travel and live a nomadic life. And when he went, Lot went with him. That's his nephew. And we're going to put a stake in the ground now and find out, for reference sake, how old he was. 75 years old. I'm not going to ask anybody here who's 75 or older to raise your hand, but let me just ask you, now that you've achieved that age, what if God just says, hey, go? What are you going to do? Not asking for an answer, just asking for you to think. 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, all the people they had acquired. That's what makes me a little uncomfortable. I don't know if you've thought about that. He had slaves, many slaves. He had acquired people. This doesn't say God approved of that. Did you notice that? Didn't necessarily say that God approved of that, but that was an institution that man had already established by that time. All the people they had acquired, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. So we find out that he did what his father Terah could not do. He didn't have a very long journey, to tell you the truth, but he just had to go southwest, and he arrived in the land of Canaan. He traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. Now, if you happen to know anything about your Palestinian geography, if you look in the last chapter of the Bible, which is called Maps, if you look there, Revelation Maps, you will likely find an area called that in Jesus' time was called Samaria, just to the east part of the Holy Land. That's where Shechem is. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Remember all the time that we spent tracing the lineage of the family of Canaan? Now, these were people that had been cursed by Noah. So they would be enemies. They are pagan people. They are not Yahweh worshipers. They were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." There's a fancy term we used in seminary. It's called a theophany. A theophany is when God appears to a person or to a group of people. So there were many theophanies, obviously. Could this have been an appearance of Jesus? Well, certainly in one way, yes, because he and God are one, but we don't particularly call it a Christophany. This is a theophany. God has appeared to him and he said, "This is the place. Look around. This is the land that I'm giving you." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. You're about to see a pattern established by Abram. As a matter of fact, just in the next couple of chapters, he's going to build 4 altars. And this is kind of an interesting idea that believe it or not, we carry on today, even though we don't heap stones and make a place to worship. You're going to find, I think, if you look back on your life, that there are some times when God has moved in a mighty way in your life, you built an altar to him. Because what you've done is you've set a marker. You've set a marker in your life. In this case, it was a physical marker where he could worship, but they many times named the altars for the occasion, as a reminder that whenever they traveled that way again of what God had done for them. So he set an altar right there as a reminder of what God had promised him about this being his land. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Now that would have been, if you look back in the book of maps, that would have been just slightly north of Jerusalem. So many of you know where Jerusalem would be found. So that's where he pitched his tents. And there he built another altar. He called on the name of the Lord, and then he set out and continued toward the Negev. Now, I want you to stop and think that at each point along the way that something significant happened. He stopped and erected an altar in thanks. And thanks to God for what he'd done. And when it says he called on the name of the Lord, that means he worshiped. That means he worshiped. He actually stopped and spent some time. It doesn't seem so odd to us now because that's something akin to what we might do. But for a man who had been a worshiper of pagan gods, this was quite unique, because at some point, and I wish we knew more about how and when that happened, but at some point in his life, Abram called on the one true God and forsook the sun god and the god of the moon and the gods of the earth, and forsook all those and called on the name of the one true God, and apparently had such a personal relationship with him. God saw he was a righteous man and said, "I'm going to make you the father of my people." However, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. That doesn't really register to many of us. I think probably as much as anyone, experienced something like that in the years 2011 and 2012. You remember the drought that we had back in that time? We had just gotten into the sheep business then. Wonderful timing. And had built the flock up to 150. I mean, there were babies running around everywhere, and some of you actually helped us work them on a big work day. And there were lots of sheep, and things were great. And boy, my son Ty was just counting the money coming in, and then the drought, and it didn't rain a drop on that ranch for 14 months. Well, what do you think happened to the grass? Listen, those sheep are just like little hovervacs. And they just walk along the ground, just eating. And here's when we knew there was a real drought. We have many cedar trees on the ranch. They were eating the cedar trees. And so like many of the ranchers around there, we didn't have much of a choice. We sold the flock down from 150 to 25. And we had to buy hay to feed them. So I understand what it must have been like during a famine, because here was a whole family that was moving around, essentially living off the land and their livestock, who had nothing to eat. So they heard that even though that there was a famine in that part of the country, that there was plenty of food to be found in Egypt. Now there were times when there were famines in Egypt too, but at least they had the Nile and the very rich deltas that would provide a living for people, and so they headed down that way. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say you're my sister. I'll be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Now, be honest with me here. When you read this, did you stop and think, wow, that Sarai must have been really a beautiful chick, a really nice-looking lady, because if they thought that the king or the Pharaoh of Egypt would say, here's what's interesting. At this point, she was eligible for Medicare. I'm just telling you. We find out later that when their child was born, when Isaac was born, that Abram was 100 years old and she was 90. So when Abram set out on his journey, if he was 75, that meant she would have been 65. This was probably at least a couple of years into the journey, so she's at least 65 and probably older. But he said, you know what? You're a beautiful lady. And when you go into Egypt, what did the Pharaoh in Egypt take? Anything he wanted. And so he had a large harem, and so if he spotted this beautiful woman, Abram knew there would be trouble, so he hatched this plot. He said, look, if they catch us wandering around, even with our pretty large size estate, they're going to grab you and do me in. So here's the deal. If they ask, tell them I'm your sister. And you know what's fun? He was half right. She was his half-sister, so maybe he's like most of us and said, well, that wasn't really a lie. But they hatched the plot. When Abram went out to Egypt, the Egyptians, sure enough, saw she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. So stop and think, sure enough, they were caught at the border crossing. And the Egyptians were going through all their belongings and said, whoa, this is one nice-looking lady. I'm sure Pharaoh he probably had them out as talent scouts, you know. He would sure like to have her. And sure enough, they grabbed her up and took her into the palace. That doesn't just mean they gave her a room, folks. That means he likely took her for his wife. Let's read forward. She was taken into the palace. He treated Abram well for her sake. Now, this is kind of interesting because with that wording, it seems kind of okay, but the fact is, Abram kind of sold his wife out. Kind of sold her out. And he was being treated well. I guess Pharaoh at least had enough decency in him to say, well, I'm not going to kill the guy, but, you know, I've got his sister in here as one of my concubines, or one of my wives possibly. And so I'm going to, make sure that he's adequately compensated. And it says that while he's there, he acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maidservants, and camels. In other words, all the trappings of wealth at that time. He apparently went down there as a man of some means, but now was probably becoming fairly wealthy. What do you think God thought about that? I'm telling you that we know that God saw during biblical times all kinds of things that didn't please him. Having more than one wife wasn't his design. Having men servants and maid servants wasn't his design. Men did it. God chose not to correct it for whatever reason he chose. But when God saw all these things going on, he looked at one man and said, I had promised that I would bless you. All you had to do is stay true to me. And what have you done? You've rented your wife out. What did he do there? You think he would just knock Abram on the head. But once again, God had a better plan. He inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai. How did they know that? Did God leave a note? We don't know. And I don't know that's all that important that we find out. But Pharaoh's not stupid. And he notices that he brings this beautiful woman into the palace, and immediately things go south all over the kingdom. He's sick. His family's sick. No telling what other problems befell them. But Pharaoh notices immediately that things are not right. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. And once again, I don't know where he got this knowledge, but he figured out what had gone on. I don't know if somebody told him. Could be that Sarai told him. Could be that she spilled the beans. But he called Abram in and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" Who blew the whistle? Like I said, don't know. Could have been Sarai. But one might think then that he would just kill Abram, because he had every right to do so. He was probably furious at what had befallen them and the fact that he had been duped. But what had God done when he took this woman as his wife? Disease, pestilence, whatever. So Pharaoh, being no dummy, thought, wait a minute. God's watching out for these people somehow. If I kill him, that really raises the ante. Maybe I'll get real problems going on here. So Pharaoh said, rather than kill him, Pharaoh just said, "Why did you say she's my sister, so I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife." I mean, I could just see him pushing her along. "Here, take the woman. Here's your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way. Catch this. Not only with his wife, but with everything he had. What did he have? He had great wealth. One might think that God would just strip him of all that and send him back to a place where there was famine. But that's the kind of fear that God had instilled in a pagan. Here's what's interesting. They didn't disbelieve in God. They didn't disbelieve him. They just didn't think that he was one God. He might have been one of many, and you see this as a common theme throughout history, that even people who don't believe that God, Yahweh, is the one true God, that he still feared him as much as he feared Ra or any of the other Egyptian gods. So he said, "I don't want to go afoul of you. I'm going to send you out the door." Here's our lesson for today. And sometimes I find that I get real excited about a lesson, and I look out there and you're going, but I'm excited about this lesson, so wake up. Verse 1. Verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." He was 75 years old. 75 years old. He was a wealthy man from a wealthy family in one of the largest, this was like Chicago of the day. Was New York. Okay? This was a major city of the day. He was comfortable, and God said, "Go," and didn't even tell him where. And how did he respond? He went. Has anybody here been through this discipleship training course called Experiencing God? Okay, quite a few of you. I don't know about you, but one of the things that really struck me, I like all the things that tell us what other people should do, right? I don't like it when you start poking my nest, right? But remember when Blackaby said, and this is a quote directly from Blackaby, you cannot stay where you are and follow God. Now, I get the same reaction from you as I got from the people in our class the day that we first read that. And they thought, oh my. Because a body at rest tends to stay at rest, right? And we like to be at rest, and God says, go. And we are all for following God as long as I can do it here, where I'm comfortable. But if you're really going to follow God, you're going to have to move. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to have to move to another town or another country or even to another room. But what it means is that you're going to have to change something. There, I've used that word right here in church. You're going to have to change something. And so I think about my personal experience, our experiences as a family, and whenever God has moved, some of them were quite painful, as when God called us to leave a church. That was painful because God didn't call me at the same time as He called Karen. And we had a very awkward discussion where she said, I just don't understand why you have to leave. You have to leave. And then she said, but I'll go too. And then God told her. And when God said that He wanted us to follow Him, that meant we had to leave. You've had moments like that. I know you have. Small ways, large ways. When I left a career to go to the seminary and go to the pastorate, that was a place where God said, you need to follow me. We had to move. And so when I look at things that we read about something that happened more than 1,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, more than 3,000 years ago, sometimes they're not relevant to us. It says, okay, God told him to go, and he went. That's never changed. Never changed. And this is something each one of us could experience. Because why should we, as 21st century Christians, find application in a history lesson about the Jewish people? Let me give you something to chew on. Don't have to turn there, but you might want to make a note. In Romans chapter 4, verse 9. Is this blessing then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he was circumcised? It was not after, but before. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believed without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Now, you're all saying, what's this circumcision stuff? What's he talking about? Here's what he's talking about, is that it said that all of Abraham's ancestors were to be God's people. Guess who that includes? We are not Shemitic people, most of us. But because of our faith in Christ, our line, my genealogy, spiritually was grafted in to God's tree. Grafted into God's tree. So we all trace our lineage back to Abraham spiritually, if not physically. So what does today's lesson mean? We are blessed through him because we call on Christ as our Savior. So when you look at the whole lesson today and say, what can I learn from it? I got two very valuable lessons that frankly excite me very much. One is that when God elected to save me, he grafted me into his family tree. You've heard the statement that God has no grandchildren. God bless my parents who also walked with the Lord, but I'm not here because they did. I'm here because God elected to save me. The other thing is that as a result of that, when God says go, I need to went. I know that made you cringe, I'm sorry. When God says go, that means we've got to move. Now, I know that one of the tendencies is to say, well, I'm 75, I'm 80, I'm however old. I'm glad that going's done. I did that in honor of John Alfred, by the way. No. What that means is that we need to keep a bag packed. Did you ever think about that? In the days back when I traveled several days a week for business, I had what I called a go bag. And it was just everything I needed to get on the plane and survive a day or two in whatever city I went. So whenever I needed to go, I had the go bag ready. You ought to have a spiritual go bag ready. So that no matter your age, when God calls you, you're going to have to move. And that when he calls you, you don't react like, as we're going to see Moses when we get into Exodus. Why? Who? How? What? Are you kidding me? Find someone else. That we respond more like Abram, who doesn't comment. He just goes. Think about that. Chapter 13 next week. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your call upon our lives. Thank you for the gift of mercy and grace through your Son, Christ Jesus. Thank you for grafting us into that tree that we may have the same opportunities, privileges, and benefits that you accorded Abram. Father, I want to thank you for this group who comes to study your word, and I always pray, Father, that it blossoms like a bloom, like a flower in their lives, Father. Now, as we go our separate ways today, help us to remember that we're people sharing Jesus, and we do it in your name. Amen.